The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents No More Debating. So I just opened the mail the other day and got my new edition of the American Atheist magazine. This is the September-October 2018 issue. It introduces the American Atheist new president, Nick Fish, and it has an article on page 20 by Tyson Gill called No More Debating. What's that? All of your eyes simultaneously rolled back in your head, and that it's absolutely unsurprising that the guy who runs the Atheist Debates channel is going to respond and object to an article that might suggest that there's no more debating? Yeah, I realize that's the case. And I also realize that there's a bunch of people who are going to look at this and say, well, of course Matt is in favor of debating. That's what he does. But I do it for reasons that I'm going to discuss. And more importantly, I wanted to point out that while I understand some of the sentiment behind this, the content in this article, I think it's incredibly wrong and obviously wrong. And it would be very tempting of me just to ignore it and say, well, okay, how many people are going to read American Atheist magazine? How many of those are actually going to read this article? How many of those are actually going to be convinced of this? And how much of an impact is that actually going to have on the world? But the hope here is that by pointing out problems in the reasoning here, I might be able to convince Tyson. I might be able to convince other people who hold similar views. So let's go through the article, and I'm not going to read every portion of it, although it's short, fills a page and a half or so. I just want to address this and talk a little bit about the how and why of debate and when we might reach a point where we could possibly be done with debates. So let's start in right at the top. I won't read the pullouts right away. We'll get to those. But the article opens with, as has every successful movement before it, the atheist movement must now move past the debate stage because there are no new arguments to make and no new evidence to present. Man, I understand this. I've talked about this before, about how frustrating it is that apologists don't ever really come up with anything new. It's not like there's new evidence for God. And what we really get are rehashed versions of the old arguments presented in a different way, which makes it a lot more about oratory and sophistry and, personality stuff, which is why I've talked about debates being theater. The problem here is that the mere fact that there aren't new arguments and there isn't new evidence doesn't tell us anything at all about whether or not we have to debate. For example, if we were going to have a discussion about Bigfoot, the fact that there's no new arguments or new evidence doesn't tell us whether or not the debating has made any impact, whether or not we've reached a point where there's no more reason to debate. Because what debating is essentially this article and my rebuttal is a debate. Yeah, we're not on the same stage. We're not under time constraints, but Tyson has presented to some extent his case here, and I'm going to offer a rebuttal and present my case for the opposite view. This is how we make our case. This is how we educate people. He goes on to say, we have raised awareness. Have we? We've certainly raised awareness, but the question is, have we raised awareness sufficiently? I mean, there's a lot of people who watch Game of Thrones, but not everybody watches Game of Thrones. And if we were to presume that because, I've seen it and my friends have all seen it, that everybody does it and there's no point in talking about it or, creating new episodes or anything like that, that would just be wrong. That we haven't, raising awareness, this is not specific enough. Because if you were previously 1% of the population and you raised your numbers to where you're 3% of the population, you are still a very, very small portion of the population. We've raised awareness, he says. We have made our arguments. We have pointed out the evidentiary and logical flaws in religious claims. We have tried to educate, and we've even gotten angry. Further debate only distracts us, helps us to normalize ridiculous claims, and stokes unfounded doubts about objective reality itself. I could not possibly disagree more. Because when he says further debate only distracts us, that's simply false. Further debate might distract us, but we also know that further debate educates and changes minds. I can't express this more clearly than by pointing to the email that I get from doing the TV show and doing debates and having people come up to me after debates and saying, when I walked in, I was kind of wishy-washy, or I had this view or that view, and you've seriously challenged those views, and I appreciate that, and I've changed my mind, or I may change my mind, or I'm going to think about this some more. This is the sort of thing that debates are intended to encourage. So even if they do distract us, and I'm not sure what, he doesn't really say what it's distracting us from, or at least not yet, Because if the goal is to change minds, then presenting your case, defending your case, pointing out flaws in the opposition's case, all those things that are debating, seems to be essential. I'm not even sure, if we go back to the first sentence where he says it's time for the atheist movement to essentially move past the debate stage, I'm not sure that there is any such thing as moving past the debate stage. There are certainly things that we don't spend a great deal of time debating anymore, but we would if they represented a significant portion of the population. He tries to give a solution here. He says, in order to break the cycle, we atheists must simply refuse to engage in nonsensical diversions, even with each other. We must reject assertions of religious belief, no matter how heartfelt, and with no more compunction than we would claims of perpetual motion, psychic readings, or leprechauns. Well, I suppose in a way I agree, because the degree of compunction that I have for claims of perpetual motion, psychic readings, and leprechauns are different, because they are asserted to different extents. They are believed by a different percentage of the population, and that belief has different impacts. So, for example, we don't really see that much in the way of perpetual motion machines. Maybe there's a lot more of it going on and I'm just not involved in that community. But we see them on occasion, and when it happens, we point out why it does or doesn't work. It doesn't. We do hear a lot about psychic readings, though, and various skeptical organizations are constantly going after those things. We don't hear that much about leprechauns. I would agree. By and large, it's not really an issue. There's a pull-out quote here that says, there's no Bigfoot wing of a political party pushing through legislation based on the teachings of Bigfoot. He's correct. There is no Bigfoot wing of a political party pushing through legislation based on the teachings of Bigfoot. But if there were, we would be and should be debating the Bigfoot issues. This view that he has, atheists must simply refuse to engage, is basically opting for silence. And here's the reason for that. If you're in a room with 20 people and you are the lone atheist, and you have a bunch of debates, and all of a sudden now there's 3 of you, that's 3 out of 20. Have you done enough now to say, okay, we're done debating, here's what's going to happen. The 3 of us are going to simply refuse to engage with the other 17 of you, and we are going to begin our process of establishing public policy for all of us, and if you want to participate in that process, you need to do it on our terms. That is absolutely ridiculous. You have to change minds and build a power base before you can pretend to assert power. Saying that atheists must simply refuse to engage in nonsensical diversions means we get nothing done and we change no minds. He goes on to say we must quit disputing creationists and no longer treat faith healing as a mere cultural difference. Well, I don't treat faith healing as a mere cultural difference. I treat faith healing as a very repugnant portion of religious belief that can actually result in people's deaths. And so by all means, it needs to be addressed. If the people are faking it, then we need to expose that. We need to educate people about how faith healing just doesn't work. And if in fact there was a faith healer who could demonstrate that they could do what they claimed, that would fundamentally change the world, and it'd be immoral for them to not go around and use that to save everybody who's dying and sick. But I agree in some sense that it's not necessarily the best use of scientists' time to debate creationists, and that this may give an impression of elevating. You know, when we put Richard Dawkins on a stage with, I don't know, Kent Hovind to debate creationism, something that hasn't happened, and I don't know that it happened. I would be opposed to it. Dawkins' time is better used elsewhere. Scientists' time is better used elsewhere, educating people on science in a way that does not risk to elevate. I agree with that. And that's partially because even amongst theism, creationism is a fairly minority position, or at least creationism in the sense that we shouldn't pay attention to it. Creationism in other senses we absolutely should pay attention to. And someone like Aaron Ra may be the best choice to engage in debates on creationism or something along those lines. But to say that we should stop debating creationism, you've got a slight leg up there, because the bulk of the scientific community, the ones that are actually going to teach and cover and deal with real science, already rejects creationism. That's not true on the broader question of theism. So he says, stop deliberating over the Bible's inconsistencies as if they matter. But they do matter. because people believe them and base their life on these things. And getting to Bible inconsistencies may allow you to move people from a more fundamentalist, rigid perspective about religion in the Bible to a more moderate or liberal perspective. There's a reason why, on some fronts, Catholics, being okay with evolution, are allies when it comes to science education to some extent. They're not allies when it comes to giving out condoms or equality or addressing other social issues. He continues by saying, instead, we must quietly assert, through our refusal to engage with these ideas, that the reality-based world has moved on. Well, congratulations. Going back to my example of 20 people, now you're up to, let's say, 6 people. So it's 14 people who believe and 6 people who don't believe. And those 6 people are going to, how is it phrased? Those 6 people are going to quit disputing. Those 6 people are going to quietly assert that they've essentially moved on and are living the reality-based world. Here's the thing. He's not wrong if we were in a position where we weren't the minority position, where if the bulk of the world was reality-based, I would agree, but that's just not the case. There's almost a break from the facts of reality here that's putting someone in a position where they're like, yep, we're done with all that, let's just move on. Of course, we cannot eliminate delusional beliefs altogether, but we're able to marginalize them so their influence is kept to a minimum. Except you can't marginalize them without the power base. Many people believe in ghosts, psychics, and Bigfoots, but those groups do not attempt and are not powerful enough to substantially influence public policy. Agreed, but theists are. Christians are, Catholics are, Jews are, all of these things, despite they fit into this realm where they can and do affect public policy. And the only way that Tyson's argument holds water is if in fact we had a power base that could sideline those. Now, in an idealistic sense, we do, because we no longer allow spectral evidence in court. But here's the really scary thing. Debates are about educating, and there may be better ways to educate. I would love it if in schools we had courses on skepticism, courses on critical thinking, if we had comparative religions courses that treated all religions equally, that didn't begin with a notion of my religion's fine, but here's all the other weird things you need to know about all the other religions, which when I took a comparative religions course in high school, it felt exactly like my mythology course. As a matter of fact, it was taught by the same teacher that taught the mythology course that I took. So there's one mythology course where you've got, the gods that essentially almost nobody believes in anymore. And then you have a comparative religions course where you learn the basics about a variety of religions. And the whole time you're sitting there, if you are a fundamentalist Christian, anything at all like I was, your take on this is, wow, all these other religions are weird. And that's probably true for people of those other religions looking at this. Wow, Christianity is weird. This death cult thing with transubstantiation and, drinking the blood and blah, blah, blah. You can pick out things like that to make any of them look as weird as they are. You can also ignore some of those things to make them seem a little less weird. If everybody around you believes something, or nearly everybody in your family, everybody in your church, they're all on the same page, then that's what feels normal. We don't have those courses in school to the extent and in a way that I think would actually benefit society to educate people on this subject. And what's worse is, if it turns out that that's the best way to do it, that means we need school boards that are going to implement those types of courses. We are dealing with exactly the opposite. The State Board of Education in Texas is constantly coming under fire from the Texas Freedom Network, from activists, Aaron Ron, other activists in the state are constantly going to textbook hearings and stuff, because the State Board of Education is predominantly made up of Christians who clearly have a bias, even if it's not their intent to, create a dominionist theocratic worldview. They are actively sidelining good science, actively manipulating what portions of history students hear, in order to paint a particular picture, a picture that's consistent with what they think is true about the world, whether it is or not. Now, how do you change that? Well, you might say, we just elect a new school board. I mean, this is the problem that Tyson's not addressing is, okay, let's stop debating and let's go make actual changes in the world. Cool. First, we'd have to elect state boards of education that are reality-based, that are reason-based, that are evidence-based, that are not biased towards theistic propositions. How do you do that? It's not enough of us to swing an election. Hell, if you look at the state of government affairs in the United States right now, fake news left and right. I don't know how anybody could look at what's going on in the United States and remotely claim that we're really in a majority reality-based community, that the majority cares about reality and factually understands it in a reasonable sense. As a matter of fact, the majority seem to feel as if reality is completely different from what I understand it to be. And I have a different view of reality than Tyson does, because I don't see that we are anywhere near the point where you could say, let's just stop debating. Because what debates do is raise awareness, which we need to continue to do. There are still plenty, as long as I'm hosting shows and still get calls confused about whether or not atheists believe in Satan or want to eat babies or we can't believe in anything or we can't have joy and happiness and meaning. As long as those questions are still coming in on a fairly regular basis, we haven't sufficiently raised awareness. Well, what else do debates do? They provide education. And it's a way to provide education where we don't have to elect anybody. It would be very nice if we could fundamentally change state boards of education, if we could elect different representatives. We have, what right now, is it one openly secular member of Congress? We've had one in the past, Pete Stark in the past. There's a new one, and I apologize, but I've forgotten her name. But, we've elected a lot of women to Congress now, but how many non-believers are there? And versus how many openly non-believers are there? We still live in a culture where, even though there are probably a sizable number of non-believers in Congress, they essentially have to pretend or act as if they believe, because that's how you get things done. Because the majority power base is still theistic. How do you change that? You can't legislate it away. Even if you had the power to do so, it would be morally wrong to legislate that away. You have to change minds. And while there are a great many ways to change minds, including structured education that is not debate, but is about teaching people how to think, giving people the facts, letting them come to conclusions, and giving them the tools to question and test their own conclusions. Those are all great. But we can't do that. So what we need is something where people can present their case, offer rebuttals to the opposition cases, and do so in a way that is hopefully entertaining and educating. There's lots of other ways to do it. We don't just have to do debates. There are YouTube channels that mock and make fun of God, and that attracts some people. There are others that are just generally educational, and that attracts people. There are former believers who are speaking to the people that they used to sit in the pew next to. There are former pastors, people in the Clergy Project, who are doing their best to engage with their former congregants in order to convince them. But at the end of the day, those are all still forms of debate, and we have to change minds. Now, debate's not the only tool. And like I said, I'm not necessarily convinced that there's a time in which debates will no longer be necessary. But I don't see a better tool. I don't see a way, as a minority view, to have a good chance of changing the perception of the majority without actively engaging, presenting cases, offering rebuttals, and educating people on mistakes in thinking. When we have better courses on logical fallacies and skepticism in the schools, we might get closer to not needing debate or not needing as much. But what I find really strange here is we live in the best possible time, the time when I think we should be doing even more debate, because this has been debated forever, but they weren't saved in a sense where they live on forever on the internet. We have a collection of videos of more debates, probably, I'm going to guess, in the last 15, 20 years than we have from history prior to that. apart from digging up old VHS tapes and somebody converting them, and they're not as high a quality, and people may not want to watch them as much. But also you have a bunch of different voices. And while there aren't, I would agree with Tyson, any truly new arguments or evidence, what there are new voices speaking in new ways on both sides, or on all sides of these issues. And as long as that's the case, as long as there's the possibility that some particularly charismatic, gregarious person could present an old argument in a new way that appeals to an entirely new group of people, that must be opposed. Oh, the purpose-driven life. Okay, well, you're cribbing these philosophers here and you're not really sticking with your Bible. Oh, the prosperity gospel stuff. Well, we can talk about that yet another time. I probably need to do a whole video on that. But when somebody says, God, you can't make a tree. All the scientists in the world with all their wonderful knowledge can't make a tree. Only God can make a tree, therefore God. If it's presented in that way, it needs to be exposed for what it is, and that happens through debate. Now, I'll agree with Tyson that it would be nice if we didn't have to spend our time kind of redoing this. It would be nice if we did live in a world where the majority of people appreciated reality and understood it in pretty much the same way. He's not against debate, by the way. He says, on the contrary, we must engage in social justice debates with everyone, even though the gap between secular and religious worldviews is deep. At times it seems like a bottomless chasm, but it's not. Our common goals and needs as humans bring our two sides close enough together to form strong bridges on a wide range of issues, but we need those bridges to be built on facts, reason, and universal values. And here is the crux of the problem and why this frustrated me so, because Tyson clearly has the best intentions. You can't make progress on debating social justice issues with someone who does not value facts and reason in the same sense that you do. You cannot have a debate with Westboro Baptist Church on whether or not marriage equality should be a thing if they are of this idea that homosexuality is an abomination that's deserving of death. You cannot fundamentally change even the State Board of Education's views on science education if they have this foundational flaw in their thinking. And Tyson knows this. He says we need those bridges to be built on facts, reason, and universal values. And before that can happen, you have to make sure that the opposition values facts and reason, and that we have a similar view of how we should go about working in the world towards understanding truth to the extent that we can. And for a lot of people, the unfortunate reality is that the core of what they think about the world and how they go about evaluating truth is based on fundamental religious notions. And that's why we're nowhere near at a point where we should stop debating religious notions. Yes, I agree. Creationism, false. Supernatural, can't be evidenced. All of the arguments have some flaw or fallacy, or they don't actually prove what people assert they prove. I agree. And we have to keep addressing that in all of the many different varieties that it rears its ugly head until such time as the majority of people are truly a part of a reality-based community. And then we'll probably still keep debating. Maybe not as often. Maybe it won't be as necessary. Maybe we can implement the changes. But the truth is, if we care about changing minds, it's always debate. Because debate is nothing but two people reasoning together in opposition. I don't know how to change minds other than that. But even if there were ways, even if just straight up simple education managed to get people over what they were being taught at home and at church, we're not there yet. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.